OsseoFiber Intelligent Bone Regeneration Technology is the first of its kind implant material. The material is stronger than cortical bone, used to securely fixate and fully integrate into the native anatomy with nothing left behind. Unlike other implants, OsseoFiber contains the same natural minerals that are found in bone themselves. It's, however, stronger, and it eventually becomes part of the bone, encouraging a return to full strength naturally without the risks and costs associated with permanent hardware. OsseoFiber offers surgeons and patients the confidence and certainty of a fully biointegrative solution that utilizes existing reimbursement and surgical techniques and provides a more natural healing environment. OsseoFiber has over 40,000 implantations in major segments of orthopedics such as foot and ankle, hand and wrist, and recently, pediatrics and sports medicine. Don't settle for metal. OsseoFiber, a permanent solution without permanent implants. I could literally listen to Mark Froimson for hours. This guy has just an amazing ability about him. He's compassionate, he's kind, he has such incredible wisdom, and literally just even the way he talks is settling, and it's like you just know that this man is a leader. We talk about his entire career, which sort of brought him to where he is now as an executive leader. He's on the boards of about 7 different companies. I love how he discusses and describes how he's built relationships and communication. He got his MBA. He was an incredible clinician for years, president of OSSIO. He's got so many facets of his career. But what I admire most is that he's given up, he's put down the knife, but yet he is still incredibly busy and making an amazing difference on the planet. I really enjoyed this episode. I think you will as well. Dr. Scott Sigman, #follow the Fro.
From medical media, this is The Ortho Show.
Hello, world. Dr. Scott Sigman, yes, your favorite opioid-sparing orthopedic surgeon here for another episode of the Ortho Show podcast, where everyone knows we bring you the best of the best in orthopedics. We like to be called maybe the voice of orthopedics. I like the current term now, the biographer of orthopedics, sharing the remarkable stories of our amazing guests. And today is no exception. We have Dr. Mark Froimson, who's an orthopedic surgeon who specialized in joint replacement. I'm going to use a term that I've never used before here, Mark. You are a serial board member, which I've never said before, which I love. And I'm going to give a little quote coming from your website. You are a physician executive with proven success in leading complex organization and teams, driving optimum performance, and fostering learning and innovation. Mark Froimson, it's so great to see you, brother.
Hey, Scott, it's great to be here. I'm really honored to be part of this. I told my kids I was going to be on it, and it's called The Ortho Show. And my son said, why didn't they call it The Ortho Pod?
Oh,
I said, I'll have to ask.
Okay, brilliant.
But it's great to be here. Congratulations on putting this together. It's really fun.
We appreciate it very much. And we're thrilled to have you on because you just have a really unique career, and you've actually, expanded your career beyond just your clinical days. But let's talk about it at the beginning. We always like to start from where, when, and why. Where were you born? Why was it medicine? Was there a doctor in the family? Give it to us.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I was born and raised in Cleveland, Shaker Heights, Ohio, and I'm back here now in Cleveland, which I never imagined. I thought I would leave Cleveland and never return. And I did have a hiatus of education and training where I left, but I'll tell you the story later about, coming back. But my dad is an orthopedic surgeon, a very well-known hand surgeon, and I saw him through the years bringing patients into the house. So I had early exposure, and it was both stimulating and in some ways I wanted to react against it. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to carve my own path. And I remember a funny recollection where my dad said, look, you don't have to go into orthopedics. You can do anything you want. If you want to be a neurosurgeon, an ophthalmologist, or an orthopedist, anything you want. Your life is wide open for you. And so I always had it in the back of my mind how happy he was, how joyful the patients were, literally in our library at home. And we had a big Tudor house, and patients would come. And my dad was the kind of guy, and he's still with us. He's 93. And I have immense respect for him, but he would just tell patients, come on over, let me take a look. And you could see the joy, you could see the relationships. And so it drew me in as much as I was reluctant to just follow, but it was a great example to follow.
And what a great compliment, to your father, right? As a parent, there can be no greater, sense of pride than having one of your children follow you in their footsteps. I'm going to shout out some names like Seth Sherman, whose father, who three generations. We've got the Redlers. We've got Michael and Lauren Redler, who are in practice, the LaFosses. So it's the
Yeah.
Froimsons, it's the Shermans, it's the Redlers. It's important people.
My daughter's a surgeon, is finishing her plastic surgery residency, so couldn't get
Oh,
her
there
into
you go.
orthopedics, but she's going to do a hand fellowship, so close enough.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it. So, all right. So it's from Shaker Heights in Cleveland, Ohio, and you're off to Princeton, New Jersey for college. And at that time, had you figured it out? I mean, you'd watched your father at that point, and you were
Oh,
sort of
actually,
gaining ideas about what you're going to do.
yeah, so actually I got to Princeton. I was in the engineering school, and I was, thinking, all right, I'm going to be an engineer, pre-med. And then I went off the deep end. I took a philosophy class. I took a course we studied a little bit of Descartes and Immanuel Kant and Ludwig Wittgenstein on, I think, therefore I am, and what is the nature of knowledge. And I had this like crazy epiphany that I said, why am I going to a trade school? Like, this is Princeton. And here I am to become an engineer and then go off to medical school. I need a real education. So I became a philosophy major, much to my family's chagrin. And I kept my pre-med requirements, but I dove deep into the nature of knowledge. I wrote a senior thesis on logical positivism and empiricism, and just kind of how do we know what we know? And I got very interested in certain authors like Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a famous book on the nature of scientific revolutions. And there's a physician author named Lewis Thomas, who is well known for The Life of a Cell. And, I just got into like thinking about thinking, and that has plagued me my whole life.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, we'll talk about that some more as your second career has really, really taken off. It may be that time as a philosopher, really may have sort of been a foundation, but somehow, some way, the philosopher still went on to medical school.
Yeah, so I went down to Tulane Medical School, which was an eye opener, going down to New Orleans from the small town of Princeton. Very eye opening. And I kind of had this philosophy on education that where you go to school is just as important, not from a prestige standpoint, but from an experience standpoint. So you should try to get as many different experiences. And so I went to Princeton, I went to Tulane, I did my internship out in California at UCLA, and then I went to New York City. So I kind of saw, education and training as an opportunity to experience different places, different ways of thinking. And I've always sought that out, like people who don't necessarily think like me, uh, people with a divergence of ideas that I could hope to learn from, who could convince me or who I can argue and debate with about whether, my viewpoint was solid and or whether there was something I could learn. There's an old saying, the wise man is the one who can learn from anyone. It's a Talmudic saying, and I view that as true, whether it's in the hospital, whether it's your scrub tech, whether it's the EVS folks who are cleaning the room, whether it's the folks in the cafeteria, whether it's your patients. You learn a lot from your patients. So life is a quest of learning. And, you should always seek out opportunities to find people from whom you can learn.
Words of wisdom. So the boy from Cleveland actually did a lot of travel before you got back to Cleveland. I think it's really quite fascinating that that was not by accident. You chose to do all of these things, but you make it back to New York, and then you're in your Columbia residency, and that must have been just phenomenal. I mean, Columbia comes up like literally every third episode. We have somebody from the
It's,
Columbia tree,
yeah,
that's had some training there for sure.
and I stay in touch. I mean, it's like a second home. It's an
Yeah.
orthopedic home for sure. And I can tell you stories about, Frank Stinchfield in one room, Charlie Neer in the other room. They scrubbed together at the scrub sink between the two rooms, being what we call the first year afloat at New York Orthopedic Hospital, trying to banter with Charlie Neer, who wasn't much for small talk, helping pre-op the patients. As you remember, all the patients would come in at least 1 or 2 days prior, traveling from wherever. Those were some really heady days. Those were fun days, whether it was, Hal Dick, who was the chairman, or Lou Bigliani, who was the head of the shoulder service. I mean,
Unbelievable, iconic, legendary names in orthopedics, right? And there you were in the training ground, but it wasn't just you, right? There were doctors like Near wouldn't let you do his prosthesis unless you came and worked with him and he could show you how to use it. So you must have had doctors from all over the world that were coming to sort of train and be with you during residency.
yeah, it was an exciting time. And we had Nas Eftekar, who had just gotten back from training with Sir John Charnley. So yeah, it was, looking back on it, I think when you're going through it at the time, you don't necessarily fully appreciate it, but you look back on it and you realize these are legends, and we're all walking in their footsteps.
And it was truly amazing. I'm about 5, 6 years apart, and but I still have these memories of truly the revolutionary time that was happening. Right? I mean, arthroscopy was just about coming on board, and then you're mentioning
Oh yeah.
Charnley, who was the first doctor doing hip replacements, and then they're brought over, and so I mean, just amazing what we do now compared to what we were doing back then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it was, back when you would, in some of the scope cases, you would have just a little eyepiece next to
Yeah.
the other, right? And there wasn't a camera at the time. I mean, there was by the time we were, in our training and finishing it, but it wasn't around for that long.
Well, at least we were looking in a knee or shoulder. The poor urologist had to put the damn eyeball by the schmeckhole as they're going into the bladder, and all this stuff is coming in their
Absolutely.
face. I'm like, come on, we got to come up with a better technique than that. But all right, so you're Columbia in the Renaissance time of orthopedics. Amazing things are happening, but the calling finally comes back. You got to go back to Cleveland, and you're going to do an amazing joint reconstruction fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic. Tell us about that year.
Yeah, so I actually, the call back to Cleveland, by the time, I finished my residency, I was married. I met my wife in New Orleans. Kim is from Miami. So I'd come south, she had come north. She was a nurse in nursing school. I was in med school, a classic story. But we were married. Had in residency. We had 2 kids. We had a third one on the way, and we said we need to go where one of our families are.
Sure.
I said, let's go to Miami. Like, who doesn't want to go to Miami? I'm from Cleveland. Like, why would we go there? And my wife is an angel, like I'm sure yours is. And she said to me, how many guys get an opportunity to go back and practice with their dad? We can always go to Miami. We can always go somewhere else. But let's go back to Cleveland. You'll finish your training. You'll have an opportunity if your dad's willing. You can practice with your dad. So I went back, I trained with Victor Goldberg. Great experience, great training. And then they wanted to hire me. My dad was at Mount Sinai. Seth Greenwald, who was running the current concepts course out of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was a private practice hospital with a residency program. I got several job offers in Cleveland. My dad lowballed me. His was the lowest offer to start. He goes, you don't need that much money. This is plenty. It's a lot more than I made.
Yeah. And and you got a babysitter, you got family to help out with the
Yeah,
kids, right? You got an
it's
income, you
enough.
got to get a nanny service. You're good.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
enough. But I'll
Dayenu.
tell you, Diana, we had a blast because let me tell you, we practiced together, and just like my wife had predicted, it was a pleasure and an honor to be able to be in the office to learn from him. But the best stories are the ones in the OR where we would do bilateral total knees simultaneously. And because we're both right-handed, I would have him do the right knee, which is obviously easier if you're right-handed. I would do the left knee. He would have one resident, I'd have another resident. He'd usually have the chief and I'd have a junior resident. And we'd use the same set of instruments, so he would get a 15-minute head start. And he would start the case, and then I would start 15 minutes later. We would do them together, and I would say, come on, I need the IM rod, like I need the cutting block. And we had a blast. And then we would go on rounds and see our patients who knew we had done this together. And I would always prep the patients ahead of time. And I'd say, make sure you say the right knee feels better. So we go around, ask the patients, which one do you like better?
I
And they would say,
I
the
love
right
it.
one feels
I love it.
better. And then my dad would look at me and be like, you'll learn. One day you'll learn.
Oh,
It
I
was
love
fun.
it. You're like the predecessor to Charlie DeCook. I mean, you guys were cranking out these in an efficient manner, father and son
Oh
team. I
yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
What a great story. So you started there, but then you made your way over to Cleveland Clinic. But then you also decided, sort of early on in your clinical practice that you were going to go back to Case Western and get an MBA. And I see your journey and your path. And a lot of times people get an MBA and it's really just to sort of fill out their resume. But I'd like to hear it from you, and I know our listeners would like to hear it. I think that must have been a very valuable time for you because
Oh,
I think you've utilized those skills in your latter career for sure.
so yeah. So the impetus was I remember sitting in my office, and this was back in the early 90s. So this was, eons ago. I was in practice. I had a great start to my practice, was having fun. But if you remember the early 90s, Bill Clinton was president, and he had decided he was going to solve healthcare. And he decided to put Hillary Clinton in charge of,
I
healthcare
remember.
reform
I remember.
because healthcare is broken. I mean, and what if you fast forward to today, right? It's the same conversation we're having, but back then it was not a $4 trillion industry. It was, in the hundreds of billions, but it was still considered a problem. And I was reading in various, the JAMA and other, not just orthopedic journals, but reading about healthcare reform. And it just struck me, like, how are the politicians going to solve this? Shouldn't doctors become more involved in healthcare delivery? Because we, at the time, right, our pen determines all healthcare expenditures. Now it's our click of the keyboard or whatnot. But I had that epiphany, that realization at the time that that doctors should become leaders in healthcare. And I said, I'm going to go back and learn about the business side. I'm not going to go to secondary sources and watch from the sidelines. Let's get an education. And it was interesting at the time to learn about the difference between medical training and business training. We tend to be risk averse. We tend to want evidence. We are always looking for what's the randomized trial, what's the evidence-based answer, how are we going to make a decision? In business, we have to take a risk to get a reward, right? And just I would ask in the case studies, like, where's the evidence? And they would just look at me because I was one of the few at the time doctors who had decided to get an MBA. They're like, what are you talking about? We've got enough information. We're just going to make a decision and see how it goes. I said, well, that's interesting. That's a
What
fascinating.
what a wonderful description. I mean, really, I mean, I've never sort of thought about it in those details, but it really is so true. I mean, as you're an entrepreneur, I'm an entrepreneur, and it's just different hats. I mean, and unless you've done it, you just don't understand it. So taking that
And
deep
it,
dive must have been
and it came
fantastic.
back to the sort of education I had in philosophy and philosophy of language and how we express our ideas. And one of the realizations that started to occur to me was that different people from different disciplines have different languages and think and construct their ideas with different sorts of logical relationships. So when you're trying to do something in your hospital or ASC and you're talking to supply chain, you need to learn supply chain language. When you're talking to the CFO, you need to understand what it is that underlie the assumptions that CFO is making and what kinds of information he or she needs in order to give you the green light to do something. And too often what you see in healthcare is that clinicians are banging on the table and we're talking clinical language and evidence, and this is best for my patients. And they're not disagreeing with you. They just don't understand it necessarily. They don't speak that language. The people, whether it's the administrators or the finance folks or the supply chain or the nursing folks, everybody has their own way of articulating. So when we say, you don't understand, this isn't good for patients, that's like an insult to them because they think what they're doing is good for patients. It's just different. It's a different framework and a different way of framing.
It's really fascinating because I think it's quite clear. I started off the podcast calling you a serial board member, and I think that, I can see why, right? You've taken all of these aspects of your career as you've moved through and sort of developed wisdom and over time. And I want to go, we could spend 3 hours just talking about your clinical, history and the amazing work that you've done at the Cleveland Clinic and all the other things you've done. We'll talk about some of it, but I want to jump in a little bit to your next life, which is where you are now. And I found that when I was looking at your CV in particular, I found it really quite very unique and very interesting because you start off with your CV not about your educational background and your time as a physician, but more about what your mantra is and what it is that's important to you in your leadership roles that you've obtained in these companies. So I'm going to use a few words. I'm not going to read the entire first paragraph, but clinical practice, executive leadership, value creation, relentless focus, strategic alliances, trusting, enduring relationships. I love that one. Life is all about relationships. Measures of success, effective communication, as you were just talking about, and building human capital and striving for excellence. What a wonderful way to describe where you are in your current life.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, I try not to make it too jargony, but I try to, I think that what I've learned is that you need to be clear. The English language is rich with meaning, and you need to choose your words wisely and appropriately. Often miscommunication happens because, people have chosen the wrong way to express themselves. So I try to convey, what I'm trying to accomplish now. And having seen it, I've had the opportunity at the Cleveland Clinic and at Trinity Health to be in leadership positions, to see entrepreneurs, to see people who thought they could add value to the system, who could bring in innovations, who could bring in new ways of doing things, falter because they weren't able to establish relationships. They weren't able to communicate. They weren't able to understand what was the goal of the person to whom you're trying to appeal. In other words, like when I was on the executive team at Trinity Health, we had a board. We had objectives. And there were very specific things, whether it was patient satisfaction, whether it was readmissions, whether it was top line or net revenue. If you bring me an innovation, you need to be able to draw a straight or dotted line to one of my key objectives if you want to get my attention. Otherwise, what we would see from many, many, people with great ideas. I mean, great ideas are a dime a dozen. Great products are common. Where they rise or fall is whether the individuals are able to connect the dots that help me understand how your great idea or your great product is going to help me achieve what's important to me, what I'm being measured on. And if you don't understand who the decision makers are and who and how they're going to measure their own success, doesn't matter how great your idea is. And so that's what kind of led me to this next phase of my career, is the insights that I would get through some of these interactions with folks. I tried to retire when I was, after I'd had a clinical career where I had felt I had trained enough people could do the procedures as well or better than I could. And having had my head down for a long time, just like you and everyone else, I said, there's more to life. I'm going to take a little break here. At the time, I was president of OSSIO, so I wasn't really out of things, but I was, taking time off clinically and taking time off from administrative tasks. This phase of my career, which started about 2017, actually started from a young entrepreneur who came up to me after I had delivered a talk at AAOS, and he wanted to pick my brain. He said, "Can I walk with you?" I said, "Sure."
Was it Eugene? It was probably Eugene.
Oh, no, it wasn't Eugene.
Okay.
No, it wasn't Eugene. It was somebody else who I got involved with, and since we've kind of parted ways. He had an exit and it was fine. But he said to me, "I need a mentor. I need someone who can help me. I need someone who can help me think things through." And he said, "Can I call you?" And I said, "Sure." And I talked to him for a few sessions, and I said, really, I have an adage, don't take free advice, because that's what it's worth. It's worth, if you should get somebody in this role in your business. And he said, "I thought that's what you were doing." I said, "Well, if, we don't have a relationship, a value relationship. I'm just here giving you casual advice off the top of my head." He goes, "Well, I want you to be my chief medical officer. I want you to come on and be an advisor to me. I'll give you shares." And that was like a little bit of an eye opener to me, that, there was that whole side that I had not yet partaken in on the startup side.
A lot of doctors they have a hard time figuring out when the end is, when they're going to retire, but so many would like to continue doing things, right? But they don't spend the time in their journey to be able to develop relationships, learn things, to be able to participate in something after you put down the knife. And so, your journey, you've been on a journey of leadership your entire career, whether it's been philosophy at Princeton, getting an MBA at Case Western. You've been on every leadership role at the Cleveland Clinic. You were the president of AUKUS. It is actually your brand. I'm a brand guy. And when I think of Mark Froimson, I think your brand is a physician executive leader. And so that means you develop Riverside Health Advisors. You're on the board of Pacira. You're on the board of Laserite. You're on the board of OSSIO. You give free time to the Arthritis Foundation. For crying out loud, you're even the president of the temple, or you were on the board of directors of the temple. I mean, this has become your calling. And so was it by accident that brand has happened, or is it something that you've worked towards in your entire career?
Yeah, so I would say that it's been something I've been working towards, but this isn't how I envisioned it. It wasn't like a pre-planned vision, but there's something that I do want to point out to you and to the listeners, which is, I always thought medicine and surgery in particular were kind of a funny discipline, in the sense that this is what I learned from my father that I thought was something I didn't want to repeat. What we do typically, your typical career as a surgeon, is that the first day of practice, you go to clinic. And then if you're lucky, you book a case and you go to the OR. So that's your first day. You're doing what you're trained to do. And then if you fast forward 30 or 35 years, on your last day, you go to clinic and they give you a little party, and you go to the OR and you hang up your scrubs and they give you a little party. And if you look at it, unlike almost any other career, your first day and your last day don't look that dissimilar, except for the gray hair and the experience and the friendships. But it's show me another career where it looks like that. It really is unusual. In sports, athletes have a career, then they go on to coaching, then they go on to, some other facet of it. So I always thought that I wasn't going to have that type of career. As much as I love the mentors that I've had who've had that type, I thought that a career should be in stages and that you should be productive and active and in the front lines. And there's no shortcut for clinical relevance and putting in your time. But you need to recognize that at some point, your time is, you've done your duty, you've done your frontline duty, and now your job is to make sure the next generation has the opportunities, has you as a mentor. You stick around, you don't quit and go play golf. You stick around, you find ways to allow and to support the next generation to build on what you've built. And that was always the philosophy. This piece of it where I've been involved with startups and innovation became more intentional as I decided to focus on those problems, right, that are impactful to our patients, whether it's infection or training or mental health or the opioid crisis like you're involved with. How can we make an impact? But not me. How can I be of assistance to people who have an interest in solving these problems and serve on their boards or serve as a sounding board or a mentor to them so that they can be successful?
It's really interesting because I'm writing a book with Matthew Ray Scott, Physician Brand RX, because I think so many doctors are really not very good at identifying what it is that makes them happy. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What is it that they want their patients to know about them? And I think for most people, the brand is a passive process that just sort of happens by osmosis, and then you get there. And so, but it hasn't been by accident for you at all. It's been decades of gathering mastership, wisdom, relationships, communication, all the things that you described that have now gotten you to be very sought after in your role. And I truly admire that as you have sort of, moved on to your next career. So what advice would you give to our listeners and to our viewers that are thinking about a similar path? How do I, a mid-level career at this point, I'm thinking about what I want to do next. How do I get involved developing these relationships with companies, startup companies, or existing companies that would allow me a leadership position with them?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is to recognize that I'm not unique. We're all multidimensional, right? And our greatest asset is not necessarily our hands. Our greatest day, we tend to narrow our focus on who we think we are, that I'm most valuable in the OR, I'm most valuable just, cranking out cases. But the wisdom that you have accumulated, that each of us accumulates over our careers is invaluable. And it's not just invaluable to us. The insights that we have and the learnings that we've accumulated are incredibly valuable to the people who are trying to solve problems that we're trying to solve. And so be generous with your time. I have a philosophy of saying yes. One of my pet peeves is that there's a general concept that the most important thing you can do in life is to learn to say no, right? Don't let people impede upon your time. Don't let them encroach upon, your activities. If you want to be successful, say no. And I say, I repel that concept, because when someone comes to you with an idea, like, it takes courage for them to come to you with that idea, right? You're intimidating, whether we like it or not. As surgeons, we are not the easiest, not the most approachable. So someone comes to you with an idea, your first reaction should be yes. Yes. Thank you. That's a great idea. I love what you're trying to accomplish here. But it's not a blanket yes. It's a philosophy that's yes, comma, if. And the comma is a time to pause. Let's think about it. Let's consider it. And then the if is, all right, I'll say yes, but if, and then you lay out the conditions that are necessary to get to yes, right? If you can get so-and-so also to get on board, if you have the financial backing, if you can show me there are great clinical results, right? It's up to you to determine what that if is, and it may, your first pass may not be right. But my advice is to say yes. I had the opportunities that I had through my career, not because I went out and said, this is what I'm going to do, or I'm going to be president of this, it's because people came to me because they knew I'd be receptive. And I said yes to almost every opportunity that came my way, which is why my wife's like, I thought you were retired. Like, what do you, and I'm involved with a lot of things. And, I go by the old adage, if you want to get something done, find the busiest person.
Mark Froimson, I could listen to you all day long. I mean, it's just amazing to me, the knowledge that you've gained over the years. You're just the way in which you speak, the way in which you think really is a settling way about you. I was with Cassandra Lee and Seth Sherman. We were presenting at the California Orthopedic Association in San Diego, knowing that all three of us were flying back to Boston for the ANA meeting. And we were all joking around that we were all members of the Can't Say No Club. And I think we're going to elect you as the president of the Can't Say No Club. In all seriousness, Mark, I so appreciate all that you've done from a clinical perspective, the time and energy that you put into the education and care for patients over decades. And now the fact that you are still figuring out a way to help care for patients that you will never meet by providing guidance and counsel to the people that are really making a difference on the planet. And it has been a pleasure talking to you, sir.
My pleasure. And again, thank you for what you do to illuminate so much in orthopedics, and for your easy manner and your leadership, also trying to solve complex problems. That in that we share and are really aligned. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, Mark, what a pleasure it has been. This is Dr. Scott Sigman, #FollowTheFro, host of The Ortho Show. Till next time.